Messages of self-love, a message of self-forgiveness. I want to talk today about habits that we pick up as children, a prison that many of us were put in, that same prison that we keep ourselves in because we're unaware, and how the habits that we pick up as children develop into patterns of behavior as an adult that prevent us from forgiving ourselves completely and loving ourselves unconditionally. This is something that I've been wanting to talk about for a while as I have navigated the uncharted waters of learning how to forgive myself. And to be honest, it was challenging. It was really challenging. But I've come to understand something that I picked up in childhood and how it showed up in adulthood. And that's what I want to share with you today, with the hopes that maybe you recognize this in yourself or some other pattern that, again, is preventing you from forgiving yourself completely and loving yourself unconditionally. It has been my experience that I could not find unconditional love until I was willing to forgive myself completely. And it took understanding with eyes of compassion this pattern and this prison that I've kept myself in. And this is what I want to explain to you. I know I've talked about this before, but one of the patterns or the pattern that led to this awareness was I would wake up first thing in the morning, which is a great time to pay close attention to yourself because you'll recognize a lot in those first few moments of waking up. I would wake up and I would scour my memory banks of the day before to see if I did something wrong or said something wrong or wrote something wrong, because I was always beating myself up about my writing. And if I felt that gut of, oh God, I did something wrong, that shame, that guilt, that remorse, that regret, I would unconsciously begin to beat myself up. And in beating myself up, anger began to grow within me. I carried a lot of anger around for several decades of my life. And that anger was projected out, sometimes irrationally, to the people around me, people that I love, especially drivers who were doing the speed limit. But it also, that anger and fear is here too, developed into the need to control my environment and everyone in it. Maybe you can relate to that. And in that pattern that I just explained to you, there was the unwillingness. There wasn't even the awareness, to be honest with you. There wasn't even the awareness of forgiveness, but there was an unwillingness to forgive that I've recently discovered. But there was also conditional love. Conditional love. I remember writing in my journal one time when I was noticing all of this, how that when everything was okay, when I had done everything right, and food and eating come into play here, because I used to beat myself up a lot for what I ate the night before. That was a big thing that I would recognize in the morning, like, oh, why did you eat that? That was so wrong. Now we're going to spend all day beating you up. I remember writing in my journal that when everything was good, when everything was aligned, when I did everything right, when I was a good girl, I haven't done anything wrong, then I could feel really good about life. In other words, feel love for myself, feel pride and appreciation for myself. But those days were fleeting. Those moments were fleeting for me. It was really more about being focused on doing the wrong thing, making the wrong choice, not living my life the right way. So that is my adult pattern that I wanted to share with you. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. All of us are conditioned at some point during our childhood. We're conditioned at different ages and in different ways, but we are conditioned. We are programmed. We take on the beliefs of the adults around us, the wounds of the adults around us, and that spark of our real self goes into hiding as a means of survival and to meet the fear-laden specifications of the adults around us. Many of us were punished physically, mentally, verbally, and in that punishment, love was denied. If we did something wrong, we were punished, hit, spanked, physically abused, had something of value taken away from us. Many of us, I don't have statistics here for you, I'm just going off my own experience, never heard those words, "I forgive you." For many of us, there was no space for our voice and for explanation or working things out, and then coming to that idea of the adults around us saying, "I forgive you for that." Because in that forgiveness, there's love, right? In the non-forgiveness and in the punishment, there is conditional love that's dripped out a little bit if everything's good. So maybe in your childhood, when everything was in alignment, everything was good, then you were offered little drips of love, but that love was conditional. I've been carrying around, and maybe you have too, conditional love for myself my entire life. I have been beating myself up. I don't need an adult or an elder around me to do that anymore. And thankfully, I live with a very loving man who has never abused me in any way, but I didn't need him to because I've been punishing and abusing myself. That's the habit. Many of us were put in a little prison, and those negative messages and that conditional love and that unwillingness to forgive and the punishment, those were all negative messages that were internalized and that go unnoticed as we move through our adult years. But then, as I said, develop into patterns of behavior where you're punishing yourself. You're abusing yourself. And I don't know about you, but I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. So I'd wake up. I'd say, "Oh, you did something wrong." Unconsciously, just start punishing myself verbally, mentally, sometimes physically. Anger builds. The unwillingness to forgive myself builds. The projection, the need to control, these are all patterns of behavior that I'm inviting you to look at. And maybe you have different patterns, but my video today is really specific towards the idea of self-forgiveness and the opening of unconditional self-love. Cannot love yourself completely or unconditionally until you forgive yourself completely. So take an honest look. Are you beating yourself up? Are you punishing yourself mentally, verbally? Maybe you're punishing yourself physically. In that, you are denying and restricting love for yourself. The love for yourself is conditional. Only if you do the right thing, say the right thing, which kind of goes into that whole, calculating what to do and say next in order to be the version of yourself that you think people will be most likely to approve of. But you're denying love for yourself. The world needs you to love yourself more and more and more every single day. And one of the ways that you can do that is to recognize where you're restricting love for yourself. It's kind of like going backwards. Here I am beating myself up again, punishing myself. Is this a pattern that developed from something in my childhood? when I was younger, ask yourself these questions. Did I have someone punishing me? Were the people in my life unwilling to forgive me? Were the people in my life restricting love or offering conditional love? If I, was a good little girl and did everything right, and are you doing that as an adult? Because my hope, my wish is that more and more women like me forgive themselves completely and be in daily intentional practices of loving ourselves unconditionally. You've been beating yourself up for far too long, and it is time for you to take a very honest look at yourself with eyes of compassion, with a willingness to be curious, with a willingness to explore, with a willingness to know yourself more deeply. So I invite you to look back at your childhood. And I just want to say that idea of anger came up. I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but that anger that I carried around for so long, a lot of it had to do with the injustices of my childhood, unprocessed injustices. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was beating myself up. And I was angry at myself because I was continuing this pattern of punishing myself and denying love for myself. So please look honestly at your life. First thing in the morning, check yourself out there. But be willing to pay attention to what you're thinking, how you're feeling, what you're saying to yourself, how you're behaving, your habits, your patterns, your tendencies. And are any of those keeping you in this self-imposed prison, even though I really believe we were put in it as kids, but we can free ourselves? Are those patterns and habits and tendencies keeping you in this prison? And how ready are you to set yourself free?